Investing Insights with Right Property Group, exploring trends in real estate and helping property investors gain financial security.
G'day guys, Steve Waters and Victor Kumar from Right Property Group and Investing Insights, and we're back again, Vic, for another filmed, recorded version of Investing Insights. And since the last time we did this, there has been some massive pieces of news. Clearly we've had the budget, we've had some other big ticket items revealed in terms of responsible lending and how that may change over the next couple of months. Open banking system, vacancy rates declining, prices moving up and down and sideways. So there's lots of these bite-sized pieces of information that are certainly creating a picture to which, to some degree, it's the first time in 20 years or thereabouts that I've been investing that I've actually seen the majority of these components or these ingredients, if you will, come together. It's
all at once.
All at once.
Yep.
Are we still missing a few of those ingredients? Potentially, but they're not going to break the bank, so to speak. But it's exciting times nonetheless. So,
and the interesting thing is that interest rates are at record lows, and now there's subtle talk of dropping it further. And there's a definite shift in terms of the media reporting. So they're now starting to talk, instead of doom, they've now replaced the D with a B, and they're talking boom.
So that 5 times really quickly. It's amazing, isn't it? Because the media does shape the public perception, even though it's meant to be a reflection of public perception. We've seen, as you rightly say, that everybody was talking about this horrific crash that was due to happen or was going to happen because of COVID, and obviously other factors as well. So I think I put it up on our Facebook page the other day. It went from 40% to 30 to 20 to 10 to 5, and now
it's the ultimate countdown, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It just basically is to the takeoff in the market potentially, because that's what they're talking about now in 21, 22, 22, 23. A lot of the forecasters within the banking systems that control the mortgages are seeing good times ahead once we get over this hurdle.
That's right.
Because it is a hurdle.
It is a hurdle. And the reason why we're saying that it will definitely be a boom is really simple. We've got record interest rates, very low interest rates. We've also got the lending rules being relaxed. Now, it hasn't all flowed through, but the onus will shift to the borrower to prove affordability within the bank's calculator. So still using that as a guide. And we've got an undersupply situation. Construction isn't that high. We've had loss of mobility, so therefore a lot of properties haven't changed hands, or more so, vendors haven't put the properties on the market because they've been able to put their mortgages on pause, see what's really happening in the market, and then come out and say, okay, now's the time to sell, or I can afford to hold on because I've been able to fix my rates. So now I'm set for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So it's all creating that perfect foundation for a big storm. And the storm's coming in our direction in the sense that the winds are favourable for us.
I was about to say the storm is, in this sense, is not negative. It's like drought-breaking rain.
Yes.
Maybe storm is the way to look at it. And look, typically and historically, we're not those people that want to talk about being too optimistic about different markets and the like. We've always been very conservative, and we always will be in our commentary and in the way that we create the strategies and so on and then execute them. However, now's just a little bit different. We only get these moments in time.
Perhaps once in a lifetime, hey?
I was going to say once a decade, but I think the last time that we experienced this potential type of increase was back in 2001-4 or thereabouts. And I remember my first property, and I've told the story before, but for those that are new listeners, I'll very quickly give you the short version. My very first property in, I think it was 2000, thereabouts. I should be historically correct, but I think it was 2000, doubled in 12 months. Now, am I suggesting that happens now? No, and I want to repeat that again. I do not think we're going to see a 100% increase in the next 12 months or anything like that. Nonetheless, the foundation, or the pieces, a lot of those pieces that were there,
they look exactly the same now,
are here today. But to be fair, there are some that aren't, such as even back then, I think it was the the invention, or not the invention, but the rolling out of the low doc loan.
Yes.
Like the real low doc loan really fueled the market. But how that ties in today is that it's the availability of credit and how it gets into the economy is how all asset classes are driven. And back then it was the low doc loan, and now we're looking at the easing of responsible lending, which we'll get to a bit later on.
So that's an important thing that you've touched on, right? So we've got all of the foundational things that have happened. The budget's favorable, the economy is favorable because of the incentives we're putting in. Property availability is favorable in inverted commas, and people are able to hold on, right? But the catalyst to all of this has always been finance. So if you look at back in 2000, 2001, with the low doc days, finance was easy to obtain. So a lot of people bought. So the demand for properties increased, and therefore the price, because everyone can now buy because finance is available. You fast forward that to today, with the change in responsible lending and the lower interest rate, finance will become a lot more available. And therefore the same thing may be repeated in terms of not necessarily doubling in a year, but certainly going through some very strong growth spurts in select areas. There will still be people that'll have a tragedy story in today's market as it was back then, because they have speculated. They've moved away from fundamentals, and then therefore they're trying to, push in all their chips in the one area, one type of property, and they haven't done their full due diligence, and they're not relating it back to their own financial situation, which is what got a lot of people in trouble in the early days back then.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because there will be a tragedy. There's always a tragedy somewhere, as there was back then, there is today. And some would argue that some of those tragedy stories that we're seeing unfold now is due to the vacancy rates of inner city, say Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane in particular, where they're double digits.
Yep.
And a lot of that accommodation was tiered towards overseas universities, business travel, basically anything that revolved around an international border, if you will. And we've seen those go from being the in type of property to purchase, which isn't relatable back to a strategy, and I just want to make that very clear. But now we're seeing those properties vacant, and 3 weeks rent free, free television, here's a holiday, a really good sign that the market is struggling. But you only have to get out to where the majority of the people live, so the mass population that are in everyday life, and it's quite a different story. And we've been talking about this vacancy rate shift for 18 months.
Yes, we have.
And now that COVID has amplified that or even brought it to the forefront, is a really important piece of news, because that's going to play out over the next 18 months and 2 years. In combination, as you mentioned, with that cheap credit and the availability, it can be as cheap as it needs to be, but if you can't get your hands on it, it's kind of a moot point. But it will get easier.
Yep.
And I said we'll talk about the open banking system and the ramifications of that, good and bad, a little bit later on. But think of it, just as a side point, think of it this way. Confidence in the consumer is driven by the cost of money. So when you have cheap credit, people spend. Now, that's a historical sort of data point, but what's quite different today is that a lot of people have taken advantage of the cheap credit, taken advantage of the JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and the other incentives, and instead of spending it, they've actually put it into their mortgage, into their offset facilities or whatever it may be. And
savings is at a record high at the moment.
In 74, I believe it was, in some of the lenders' books, which is huge. Now, the budget is the exact opposite of that. They want you, they're giving you money. Here's a handout, or if you will, free kick. Here's a tax break. But do us a favour, please don't put it into your mortgage. Go out and spend it, is what they're indirectly saying. Spend the money to get the economy percolating. I'm just not sure that the Joe public will do that.
Yeah. So at the individual level, I suppose they don't. But if you look at, say, the incentives they put in front of businesses in accelerated asset write-offs, and being able to go back and use it as tax deductions for the previous year, that's actually forcing the businesses to spend the money rather than giving them a tax cut as such. So that'll flow through in the economy.
It's huge. It's a big call. And so we've had the job seeker, we've got job keeper for a little bit longer. So realistically, what they should be concentrating on now is job multiplier. And the only way to do that is to have business invest in themselves, which starts that cyclical effect of then eventually hiring more people spend, and the wheel turns. So it has to be a job multiplier effect as opposed to, well, let's just put a Band-Aid on this now, because that's not going to work at all.
Yeah.
So our asset class, being property, has had some pretty big news. And whilst the budget, there was nothing in the budget that was new news.
No, it was all selectively leaked well ahead of time.
Yeah.
And we also knew that there was only so many levers they could pull. And it was pretty much premeditated as to what they will change. It's just that we didn't know how much the change was going to be.
Exactly. And it was selectively leaked. Well, it wasn't even leaked. It was just said, I think, beforehand. So there was nothing in the budget that for property investors was like the holy grail of new news. So you could maybe think about it this way, that there wasn't anything that was against the grain that would make you step back and reassess.
So a good example of it is in one of the budgets, they changed the depreciation rules.
Correct.
That was a huge change in property investing. So there was nothing like that. In fact, I was quite surprised that there actually wasn't much on property in itself.
I think the home builder, the extension of that was big enough news, because indirectly that's a force multiplier.
Correct.
Because it goes all the way down the line with a new build, as opposed to buying a second hand or an existing property. There's not that many other parties involved within the economy. So I can understand that they're doing that. Do I agree with it in that context? Potentially not. But that will have an effect from a groundswell point of view, where it will lift entire markets just based on the number of transactions and the limited supply that we're seeing. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to be great investments for the long term. No. But in the meantime, we're going to see some tick up in those prices. But the sentiment state by state, because I'll come back a step. We've got the federal budget, which has given us the news, and there's a flow-on effect down to the state levels here, and some of that might be through the federal funding to infrastructure projects, roads and rail, and use it or lose it approach. And they've said that quite loudly. The sentiment state by state is quite and remarkably different as well. Well, now clearly we've got Melbourne, who's in a stage 4 lockdown, generally speaking, and that's hindered transactions. And I'm not talking about just real estate. That goes all the way through to retail spending. But because Melbourne is such a large part of the data market, it started to affect the data generally throughout the rest of the country. And if we relate
Mel's the second largest population, right?
Correct.
So think of it.
If we take that from a property perspective, and let's talk about vacancy rates. So the market and the media and the economists want to talk about the general market and the general vacancy rates or price increase, decrease, whatever it may be. Melbourne is a large portion of that. So when you've got no mobility or very limited mobility, therefore lack of transactions, whether it be sale or rentals, that is going to directly affect the averages onto which the media report. But when you get granular, it's quite a different story.
Very, very different story. Yeah, very different story. We've been buying properties in Melbourne for many, many years, over a decade. And realistically, there hasn't been as low a vacancy factor in these areas that we're buying in, because everyone's moving to these areas and they're getting out of these high rises. They're getting away from the CBD scenario and into more sedate family life, if I can put it that way.
Sedate. I can hear the feedback already.
So you're seeing the definite spike. And a flow on also is that in the regional areas, we are starting to see a spike in terms of pricing, but it's not led by investors. It's led by mostly owner-occupiers, because they're looking at it and saying, okay, I can rent, or now I can actually afford to buy, and I really don't need to move from here. Or I've moved from there to here because it's a lot cheaper. I can get into the property market. I can have my own piece of real estate, and I'll look at it, reassess it in about 5 years' time to see where I go from here.
That brings up a really good point. I want to sort of tack for a minute, change the subject, if you will, as we always do, as I often do, and then we'll come back to whatever the subject was. That With the regional areas, well, I'll even come back a bit further. So you mentioned that a lot of these price increases are led by the homeowner, and we're seeing that throughout various areas of Australia, whether it be southeast Queensland, parts of Sydney, not Melbourne to a degree yet, but we'll see those numbers start to come through the pipeline soon when they get that mobility. Perth is another example where the homeowner and the credit that it's associated with them taking up the homeowner skill, the home builder and purchasing, that's starting to show through in the data in terms of new mortgages.
Yes.
It's huge. It's biggest. September's huge, biggest in years in terms of a monthly increase. And so the market recovery, or that groundswell, if you will, is led this time by the homeowner as opposed to the investor.
Yep.
What will happen though is the investor, as soon as they get that ability to borrow money, is they'll enter the market, because it's still not easy for the investor, no matter what anybody says, to get into the market today with credit. But if I want to come now back to the statement you said about the regional areas and how we're starting to see a tick up in value there. And a word of warning around the regional areas. And we do, as a disclaimer, we do invest regionally throughout Australia. But our interpretation of regional may be different from somebody else. I'm not a fan of the subpar regional areas. Even though
it has to be major regional.
Correct. Even though we're seeing quite a lot of people move to these areas from the CBDs and metros for a better lifestyle change in combination with affordability and what have you, I'm not sure there's a lot of longevity there. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not bagging regional areas because I think there's so much potential there. But once you get out of the major regional areas into those smaller regional areas, the longevity, the future could be a little bit different. And here's an example, which I think we did on our live, one of our Facebook lives a couple of weeks ago, is that eventually we're going to need to get back into the office environment.
Absolutely.
Right? Because there's a culture aspect there which you can't do and breed, if you will, when you're by yourself. So there needs to be that human interaction that can only be in an office atmosphere. Now, whether that goes to 4-1, 3-2 days in the office is yet to be seen. We have the technology to be able to work remotely, but once again, we don't have the culture and that connectivity. So when we swap back, when employers start to say, okay, well, I need you back in the office and you're living 5-6 hours away from anything and you can't particularly do it remote, or your employer won't let you, you then have a choice. I leave the job and I look for work locally, of which there isn't a lot of work when you go into those subpar regional areas, or you actually move back to the metropolitan area. So whilst we see that, and I think the latter will be the case. So we see this swell in price now, but I believe that over the next, say, call it 5-ish plus years, we'll start to see that go back.
Shift back.
Yeah. As people come back into the metropolitan areas, or the major regional areas as well. So we need to be careful as investors that whilst our strategy is still, from a holistic point of view, quite solid and still the same, the asset selection that we do now can't be just for the now, and it still needs to be for our 5 and our 10 and our 15-year trajectory, if you will, or assumptions on what the market will do, so that it gives us longevity and safety within the market.
Yep. So what you're saying is that we should not ignore fundamentals and not just chase transient trends because of the virus, because of the way population is tagging. We still need to look at it from a fundamental point of view, that this is the foundations that we look for in terms of these areas. Here are the fundamentals. It needs to tick those boxes first before we go any further, regardless of how good a growth trend or how low the vacancy factors are in that area.
So when you're chasing trends, that's a really good point, because if you chase the trends, you have to have your finger on the pulse of that trend every second of every day of every month of every year, because the trend, as quickly as a trend establishes itself, it can fade away to nothing as well if there's no substance behind it. And for those that want to chase the trend, then they're a speculator, they're a gambler, as opposed to an investor. And so they'll want to be in and out of that market. So you need to make sure, if that's your gig, that there's enough liquidity in that market to be able to get out when you need to. Otherwise, you're stuck there.
Yeah. So let's explore that further, right? So you're saying enough liquidity. So what we mean by that is that there needs to be a buyer on that property ready to buy off you in a bad market to begin with, because chances are you'll need to sell when things go sour, either for your employment or in life or the economy itself, right? So you need to have enough people willing to buy in that area. The other thing you mentioned was that you need to have a finger on the pulse in terms of the trend. And this is not just during the buying phase. This is even during the holding phase. You need to be constantly coming back to your research to say, is it still holding true? Is the market still in the same trajectory in terms of rentals, in terms of values, in terms of liquidity? A really good example we had brought up during our Facebook Live, Steve, if you recall, was Port Hedland and how people were chasing the trend there. So Port Hedland, for those that don't know, is a mining town in Western Australia. So people are chasing the trend there. The trend was extremely high yields. This was based on the mining being still in its setup phase. So therefore, there was a lot more consultants, there were a lot more workers being brought in. So there was an accommodation shortage, and the yields went gangbusters. So properties that were worth 300 all of a sudden became $1 million because of the fact that they could get 15-20% yields on these properties. And everyone jumped on, and people did make good money. My sister bought in there because she was living there and running a business there, and she made good money because she had the finger on the pulse in terms of the market going up, the market coming down, and a lot of people have been able to offload their properties by following the trend on a regular basis, and it's not a set and forget investment.
When you take on more risk, it can't be a set and forget investment. And a risk could be interpreted by the way that the market moves or the variances within the market. When you have a market that is perpetuating quite quickly, there's an element of risk attached to that, but some people just refuse to acknowledge it.
Yes.
Because whatever goes up quickly must get back to an element of normality, its long-term averages. And that's usually preceded by a contraction in price and then a period of nothingness.
Yeah, so it normalizes, right?
Correct.
So it normalizes back to where its normal base is, and that's what we need. That's where fundamentals come in handy.
100%. So let's have a look at let's come back to the budget for a minute, because the government is trying its best to stimulate the economy. There's no secrets about that. And there's an element of which we mentioned earlier on, the consumer confidence, and that's via the availability of credit, and cheap credit at that, but also being in a position that they can get out to spend it. And Melbourne's a really good example of they're not out to spend it. And so when you look at the indexes around consumer confidence, whilst Melbourne is starting to gain in the index or in the data now, for the last 6 weeks, their consumer confidence has been quite low, and as a result of that, they haven't spent, mobility, etc. But if you look at the other states, if you look at Sydney, you look at Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, ACT, and Tasmania, where people still have degrees of mobility, they're able to spend, and the localised economies, whether it be state-based or even council-based, still percolates, still keeps jobs, and that confidence wheel, once again, starts to spin. But the one thing that doesn't change is that everybody still needs accommodation.
Yes.
Whether you have a job or you don't, you still need the accommodation. And that ties in with something that we talked about, I think it was last podcast, with Phil, where we were talking about the potential of an accommodation crisis that is starting to come to fruition over the next couple of years. Now, Labor in their commentary around the budget was that there was really not enough around affordable housing for those that needed it, and potentially rightly so. But as the government replied, they're not in the business of being a landlord. They tried that. Even state governments tried that, and it didn't go well for them. They want private investment to do it so that they carry the risk, they carry the repairs and maintenance and everything also goes with being a landlord to supply the accommodation, but they need to make it attractive enough for the private investor to want to do so. Now, they had a couple of cracks at that with, and I've just gone blank, what was the... NRAS,
Yep.
Which was the biggest rort in the worst possible sense that I can think of as an investment platform. On the surface, there were some pretty good things to look at, but it quickly unravelled for the investor.
Yep.
Nothing's for nothing is the bottom line. And there's nothing like that in the budget this time.
No.
To help people want to invest in terms of affordable accommodation, because as commercial investors, because that's what every investor is from a commercial aspect, is they want to minimise expense and maximise the income. There has to be something there for the investor to want to entertain.
That's right. Yeah, to part with their money, basically.
Correct, because as good as it may seem on the surface and noble, if there's not a price increase there, and if it's going to put our own family units on the line, human nature is you're not going to do it. I mean, it might look good to begin with, but once you unravel and you start to understand what it's about, you're going to look for an exit strategy, and there's no one there to replace you.
Yep. As you're talking, I had an epiphany, and Steve, this is going to be a FOMO moment next year, on the assumption that we get some level of vaccine, say in July. There would be a mass rush for people to invest. Because hang on a minute, if we've got stability, we've got the property prices will take off, and so it'll be self-perpetuating in that sense, and in the sense of people with the FOMO coming in the horde. So if you recall back in 2016-17, what happened in the Sydney and Melbourne market might potentially happen all across the metropolitan areas of Australia, in that sense, because people rush in to try and invest, and for some trying to catch up with their investment plans. For others, it may be that they have had the epiphany to say, hang on, my job's not forever. I need to cater for my retirement. And invariably, mark my words, you'll see people come out of the woodwork in terms of advisors as such, that'll have that new trend, new fad. Let's take onto this government incentive. Let's do something really sexy and get into the property market this way. Again, this is where people get financially hurt.
That's a good point, Vic, because one of the things that I see as my role on the board of Pippa is the amount of complaints from the consumer that come in to people that perhaps didn't do enough diligence themselves to begin with, and on the surface something that looks shiny and attractive and very rewarding overnight, they entertained, and as a result it went pretty bad for them. Now that's not every case, but we certainly see enough of it, and it makes me think that the strategy that you create, it needs to be agile and not fragile.
Good way of putting it.
And what I mean by that is that the strategy needs to be able to move with the market dynamics, because no market is ever linear. It's never a straight line from A to B. There's always twists and turns as the economy unfolds or contracts or whatever it may do, as does the localized fundamentals of the suburb economy, for that matter, from a micro point of view, not just a macro point of view. So if your strategy that you create isn't agile enough to be able to move with the times and survive those times, then you've actually become the victim of being quite fragile in your approach to creating your portfolio, because what we're trying to do is bridge the gap between where you want to be and where you are now.
That's right. And along the way, things change. The economy changes, the market changes, your financial circumstances can change, or we can forward predict that the finance is going to be harder. So we need to change tech right now, right? So one of the things we do when you and I sit down with clients or people that want to come on board and use our services is we address these things. And whilst we may have put in a plan to say, let's buy 3 properties in 5 years as an example, it doesn't mean that you will actually buy 3 properties in 5 years. It could be 3 properties in 3 years. It could mean 3 properties in 7 years, because 5 years is a long time in property and things change. So our constant reviews and our ability to forward predict and look at the performance of the current property in the portfolio and bring in the right property in as a next addition to the portfolio is always geared towards working towards your goal, taking the nuances and the changes of finance, economy, and your own financial circumstances into account to then fine-tune the plan. So it's always agile, as you said. We need to keep changing it to keep it on course.
Yeah, and to be clear though, agile is not around going from 180 degree direction.
That's right.
Change. It's just these little
minor adjustments.
Yeah, incremental adjustments along the path that keep us true north, so to speak. All right, so let's now get to what the markets are actually doing now, because we've had a lot of these good news. And just to recap, we've had the budget. There's no bad news there for investors, really. Could have been better. Could have been a lot worse.
Yep.
And we'll live with it. And there was no secrets in terms of property-related announcements. We've got the potential or the communication around the relaxation of responsible lending laws. And just very quickly, that's not about a carte blanche approach where everybody's going to get this fistful of money. It's still going to be a very measured approach where the onus now comes back onto the borrower as opposed to the lender.
Yep.
And we do have open banking, and we do have APRA still regulating. So there's still going to be a very strong element of regulation. It's just now hopefully a more balanced approach as opposed to sheer stupidity.
Absolutely.
Why did you buy the pair of shoes, and do you do that every day scenario? We have tightening markets in terms of rental or vacancy, but also in terms of listings. And we also have an increase in lending. In fact, huge. And I've got some stats here or just some recent, I should say, lending percentages, if I can find it, where just in the month alone, so owner-occupier lending year on year, excluding refinances, New South Wales up 29%, Victoria 24%, Queensland 34%, 27% WA, 34% South Australia, just about 40%, Tassie 33%, Northern Territory, ACT 36%. So Australia nationally is 29% year-on-year increase.
That's huge.
Like, just wrap your head around that. Like, they're big numbers. Like, it's over 1/3 increase. It's massive. And yet usually we're doing sort of statistical cartwheels, if you will, around incremental changes of 1% or 2%. But to get these figures is huge. And then, of course, coming back to the major points, I mentioned vacancy rates, but I don't think people can actually understand how tight it is. Because all we do is see the headline news from the media about littered or streets littered with vacant properties and double digits in the CBDs, which there is.
We were talking earlier about one of your clients that doesn't even own the property and has got smashed with applicants. 33.
So he takes possession, I think, tomorrow or the next day. And this is a duplex, about 30 minutes from the CBD, giving a 6% yield. Cost of his money is just under 3%, so it's not a bad spread to begin with, and it suits his circumstances in that portfolio as a cash play. But 33 applicants, doesn't own the property, and out of the 33 applicants, 2 have been approved, ready to go before he even takes ownership.
And higher than what we had said the rental would be achieved, right?
Nearly 15% higher than what we budgeted on in terms of the rental return, which is massive. But that's a clear indication of where the market is at this point in time.
Exactly. Now, I want to bring it back, though, to the other side of the coin as well. Just because we're saying the markets are tighter, that doesn't mean you start charging or asking for unreasonable rent that is not sustainable in that area, and you're not competitive enough with the other properties that are on the market, right? So you need to do your due diligence before you name a figure in terms of rental. Otherwise, you will remain vacant. Your property then drops past page 1 in the web. And I tell you this, no one looks after page 1 if they're looking for properties.
Do you know what? And that's such a true statement. Even last night, I was on the .com platforms, real estate and domain and the like, and literally, I don't think I would have got too many times past page 1. Because in my mind, I'm saying, well, they're old listings, they're probably under contract, and realestate.com and domain, please, when things are under contract, make it a law that they've got to remove them so it's not clickbaitable. It kills me. But that's the reason I don't go past page 1, especially in today's market.
So if you're a renter and you're constantly looking, you would never go past page 1. And then the other thing as well is that don't put too many hurdles in front of them. So one of the things that, and we digress a little bit, but this is still relevant. One of the things that I helped one of my clients was he was not having much luck getting applicants for his property. And this was now getting into week 3 in an area where week 1 you should have been smashed with rentals. But it was a simple thing as the property manager putting in there that you need to apply first and then I'll let you view the property. Not in those exact words, but that's what they meant. Then the link that was given did not work.
And you're paying for the privilege.
Correct.
In terms of property management.
So as an investor, be invested in your investment in the sense that you need to be looking at it from a daily point of view to say, check the ads, click the links, look at the photos as if you're a renter. And if you can't make head or tail of it, know that the renter can't either.
Absolutely. And as Vic said, don't be too greedy, because the consistency of cash flow is far better.
More important.
Far better for you than an extra $10 or $15 a week. It'll take you more than that to actually find the right tenant to pay it. So be fair, be reasonable, and be an investor at the end of the day. Make sure you cross the T's and dot the I's. So let's now come back to how these markets are moving today. So let's not worry about the data, because that's
reverse facing.
Reverse facing, and it's 3 months or thereabouts old. So what's happening today around the states that we're constantly in on a daily basis? So here's some news from the I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, where, and I might have mentioned this on one of our lives or something, where I had some friends that are in the RAF in the Air Force, and they were looking to rent a property. They didn't want to go through the DHA or Defence Housing, and this is in Sydney corridor, and they were 35, I think, one of 35 people through the open home on that day. They ended up having to pay an extra $30 a week and prepay 6 months in advance to win, and I say that quite deliberately, to win the property to rent.
When was the last time you saw that?
This is going back
01 and 09.
Yeah.
Yep.
I didn't want to say it. Once again, I'm trying not to be too buoyant.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm just a reporter reporting the facts more so than anything. But that's in the Sydney corridor, but you would not see that in the media anywhere.
Yep.
Anywhere. It's more about the bad news. Now, that doesn't mean that yields are 10% or anything like that, but when we have such a tight market, supply and demand is just the basics of economics, and that's what we have here in this commodity being real estate. Now, there are, once again, to be fair, there are areas throughout, in this prime example of Sydney, which are oversupplied, being those CBD areas and subpar accommodation or investor stock as opposed to investment grade. And there's a big, very, very big difference. But in the central coast, the south coast of the Sydney corridors, we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing the same thing in Brisbane. Perth has dropped down to below 1% vacancy rates.
Now, let's put that in perspective.
I say that quite deliberately as well, yeah.
So about 8 months ago, we were talking 6% as a vacancy factor. And now it's less than 1%. That's a significant turnaround.
Do you know what? As you say that, I remember distinctly you and I over there. I don't know if it was 2 years ago, maybe. I don't recall. Wouldn't have been much longer than that.
You're giving the hairdresser example, are you?
Yeah, I am. It's where what Victor and I do is we use data as a directional piece. Once again, we're very much more around ground truth, and part of our scope is in new areas for us, Vic and I, to physically go to these areas and spend an enormous amount of time speaking to local councils, the mayor, business owners, everything that is that gives us some truth around the local economies, because that's where the money's being spent. Yeah? And so we were over in Perth, I can't remember the suburb, and we were just driving, I think, and we were in some suburb not too far out from Perth, call it half an hour. And
if that.
There were streets of houses that were vacant with the grass halfway up the walls. People are just like, it was almost like a movie scene where people just washed their hands of it, throwing the keys against the fly screen and said, I'm out. Scenario. Now, I'm being a little bit dramatic there, but it just looked like that as we drove the streets, and full office towers in the CBD empty. And that's quite an important point, because they're the employers of the economy. Yet you fast forward to where we are today, and we've gradually seen that. And the hairdresser scenario that Victor's talking about, where he was asleep in the barber chair, there was no business, and was for hours as we drunk our
multiple coffees,
choy latte. But it was, interesting enough, the coffee shop was the busiest place in the shopping centre, because no one else had anything else to do. And once again, that sounds a little dramatic, but that's exactly how it was. The data didn't reflect that. Just as the data potentially is not reflecting what happened 3 months ago. Now, in terms of the vacancy rates, and it is that tight over there. Does it mean boom times? Not necessarily. Does it mean that it is more favourable than what it was 12 months ago? Absolutely, it does. And this is the theme throughout various states and metropolitan areas or cities throughout Australia. Now, I know there's a lot of media at the moment talking about, say, parts of Queensland that they expect to grow by 23%, I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a general comment. There are some areas that won't.
Yep.
There are probably some areas that will do better than that
Mm-hmm.
as well, as there will be in Sydney and Perth and potentially Melbourne as well.
Any growth predictors that are out there, like predictions out there, they're talking general average numbers. That doesn't take into account suburb by suburb, street by street, types of properties, clusters of properties. They don't take that into account. They take an average figure and saying Sydney will grow by 20%, Melbourne will grow by 15%, 20%, Queensland will grow by 23% because that's on record of people saying that, right? It doesn't mean that every property that you'll buy will grow by that much. Yep. It may be that some may go backwards even while everyone else is going up.
It's a good point, because there is always going to be a subpar property in an area.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that people need to understand, if they're even entertaining purchasing over the next couple of months, is you need to be active now around your personal circumstances.
Yes.
So if you haven't got finance, then start organising, because there is a lag. 5 C's of credit: character, capital, capacity, collateral and conditions. They all add up. So if you've got credit cards or you've missed a payment for whatever the reason being, but it wasn't your fault, clean that up now. Start moving now so that you're in a position to borrow potentially in a couple of months, 3 months' time. If you are finance ready or you're going through those motions now, know that it won't be an overnight result. There's as I said earlier on, there's a lead time. In some cases up to 6 to 10 weeks we're experiencing, depending on who the lender is. But also, coming back to the strategies, finding out and identifying what strategy is going to let you sleep at night, which is very, very important. But please, I really do beg of you, and when I make this statement, is don't create the strategy based on cheap interest rates of today.
Interest rates will go up.
They will go up, and probably a lot quicker than what everybody is talking about should the economy start to perpetuate. So
because that's the only lever we can pull to reduce inflation or keep inflation in check, right? We've given everything away. So the only lever left is the interest rate to slow things down.
And they will put rates up one day. No one knows. Not even the economist knows. Let's to be fair, we know as much as them and they know as much as us. It's just a bit of a guess. But they will go up. And so we need to make sure that the strategies that we create today are sound, they're financially correct, they have their mitigation points in place, which is always around buffers and cash flow. That doesn't mean positive cash flow, it's cash flow management. So you need to start as you mean to continue. It's a very, very important fact. So asset selection, strategy, buffers, capital, cash flow, borrowing, it all comes together, and it's not something that you create overnight or pull out of a hat and go, here's the magic bullet. It takes time to create.
Absolutely. And no one knows your financial circumstances better than you. Only you know whether you will be able to repay that loan if things go pear-shaped.
That's going to go all the way back to responsible lending.
Yes,
you watch the argument.
Yeah. So is responsible lending is becoming a bit irresponsible, if I can use that word. Responsible borrowing comes to the forefront. So you need to become a responsible borrower and look at it from the worst case scenario. Stop doing your calculations on 2.5% interest rate. My suggestion is do it at 4%. Right? So at least you've got some buffer in there in case the interest rates start taking off really quickly and you haven't been able to pick that and mitigate your circumstances ahead of time.
But be selectively aggressive if you're in the position.
That's right.
Aggressive doesn't mean taking risks. It means being tactical.
Yeah.
And you can be the tactical investor as long as that plan is set up. And then you always revise that plan as we mentioned earlier on. And for us, it's about doing reviews, and that might be around the position of the portfolio or what's needed next. In fact, here's a good example. I was doing a review yesterday with a client, and just literally by simple 3 phone calls to the different lenders, he saved $3,500 a year.
That's quite significant.
Just like that. So that's the equivalent of $60, $70 a week, call it, over if you equated that to income on a property rent-wise. And you'd be doing cartwheels and group hugs and high fives if you increased your rent by $70 a week. Then you should be probably more ecstatic when you save that amount of money because it's all tax-free.
That's right. Yeah. So there are a few drivers in terms of managing your cash flow, right? Obviously, interest rate's one thing. The repairs and maintenance on the property. So, a lot of things you need to nip in the bud in terms of doing the repairs early enough so that it doesn't become a major repair.
Preventative maintenance.
Yep, that's right. And then the third, of course, is increasing your rent. So be very strategic about how long you are, renting out the property for, whether it's 6 months, 12 months. Also be mindful that different states have got different legislation in at the moment around COVID in terms of your ability to increase rents. But that still doesn't mean you can't increase the rents when the moratorium finishes. So a good example of that is the Perth market, in that where the 31st of March or 21st of March is when you can next increase your rent next year, right? 2021. So in my portfolio, I've got a property that's due for a release. So we've then put that person on a 6-month lease, knowing that I'll be constructing there next year. Yet what I've done is put a clause in there to say that assuming that in March they will remove that moratorium, we will bring the rent back to market rates. So I can't increase the rent right now, but I've actually included it at that point in time. Yes.
Yeah, and that's important because that's cash flow management. But
That's
once again, we stress you want to stay within the rules.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the state-based regulations, and your property manager will be or should be very in tune with what those laws are and keep well abreast of what they are. So as we move forward into today's market, and we're all under the agreement, and even our peers within the industry, we're all in agreement of where we think the market is going. And I know for a lot of the media organisations out there and reporters, it's been quite a slap in the face for them in terms of their predictions again. But herein lies the problem: is that there's sensationalising the data, and then there's the interpretation of the data. Now, we all consume data pretty much the same. It's just how we interpret it.
That's right.
And
based on our experience and based on our on-ground knowledge.
Correct. And unfortunately, a lot of people just look at data in isolation without actually adding that other component being truth to it. And it's wildly inaccurate, and it can lead you down a very, very dangerous path if that's all you rely upon, because there's a human element attached to this. This isn't an algorithm-based asset class. This has a human touch, a big human component to it.
Because that's the end user, in both terms, right? So both in terms of rental and also in terms of someone that's going to buy it off you at when you're ready to sell.
Absolutely. Now, we're only talking really about residential here. Then we have the whole commercial aspect, of which we do quite a lot of commercial as well. But let me stress, there's a real time and a place for commercial. It's not for everybody, and it's certainly for the majority not the cornerstone.
Not in the early pieces.
Yeah, of your portfolio. It's something that you need to add or tack onto to support the cash flow or create the cash flow. And even as an end owner scenario, where that might be one of the properties that you retain in ownership forever and ever, because it is giving you that higher return. But it needs to be in combination with residential. I probably shouldn't have gone down that rabbit hole because it's far more complicated than a 30-second soundbite, nonetheless. So where to from here, Vic? What's the market going to do you think, between now and Christmas?
Look, I think given that we are into spring, so there's a lot more people around, the buoyancy in terms of people going out and about within the restrictions that are in each state is certainly there, which is sort of given us the increase in terms of the number of people going out to buy, right? It hasn't increased the number of people that are willing to sell. So there's still that shortage and a gap. And a lot of people that have been putting things off till let's see what happens after September, whether they increase or JobKeeper, whether they keep it going. So that cliff's been avoided. And we can see that the cliff won't be there in March either, because there's a slow, gradual weaning off JobKeeper as such for the business.
And mortgage moratorium.
Yes. And yes, that mortgage moratorium as well. So there hasn't been a big cliff over there as well. However, those that need to sell because they have perhaps bought a bigger home and now they need to offload, they will need to sell, and therefore they will price it accordingly. And this is where the connected will get the better properties. So what I mean by that is this is now becoming more relationship based than just eeny, meeny, miny, mo on the internet and say, I'm going to buy this property for my investments. Because as you and I do, we get to most of our properties well ahead of it being loaded up on the net. And sometimes, if I look at an example of a property that we secured yesterday, it was on the net for a month and a half, but at substantially higher prices. But the motivation changed. Motivation changed because they found their dream home and they're now relocating now that they need to sell. So an adjustment of price of 70,000 that hasn't flowed through in the adjustment on the net just yet we are able to get that secured because of relationship.
That's a really good point. And that is, I wish I could use that example. Actually, I will. So that everyone wants to talk about under market value. And so value is in the eye of the beholder. The data on that in terms of discounting will be huge. Asking prices versus...
It probably mean that it'll hit the point of suburbs most discounted in Australia.
Yeah,
right?
But it can. You get a couple of those and it
Yes.
will. And I'm actually working on one very similar, which we talked about earlier on, where it is legitimate $117,000 below its sale price. Now that'll affect data, but there's a story behind it. This goes back to the truth piece behind the data. So if we look in your case about, imagine days on market, which is an indicator plus average discounting, it could very well be a reportable news piece, but it was never worth that. And it was never worth that because no one bought it.
Plus his motivation wasn't there. He wanted it at the listed price.
Correct.
Because he hadn't found his dream place.
So it was probably somewhere between what he listed it for and what you purchased it for and negotiated for was where it really sat. But now he's become a seller with intent.
Yes.
As opposed to a seller with, well, I'll create the price and you
let the market meet me.
And let the market meet me. And that's another great point because we are seeing that everywhere across Australia at the moment where vendors are becoming a little bit more ambiguous and they're saying, okay, if the market price is I'm just plucking numbers here. If it's $500,000, cost of money's cheap. I'm under no duress. It's $500,000. You know what? Put it on for $530,000, $540,000 and let the market meet me because I can see the market moving.
Yeah.
And so when there's no, I'm not going to say desperation, but when there's no real cause, there's no hurry to sell a property, vendors, when you get to a market like we have today, they'll start to create the market value because they'll insist that it's listed and sold at a price. Now, what real estate agents then fall into the trap, well, it's not even a trap, they have to do it to get the listing, is they need to agree with the vendor.
And then condition the vendor.
Even if what Victor means by conditioning is starting to say, well, we said it was worth $540, but the market's not saying that. Maybe we've got to put it at $530. But when you get a rising market, the vendor, the seller is less inclined to do that. They'll hold firm. So what happens then is that one or two agents start to what we call buy the listing. So they say, yeah, I agree with you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Deep down they don't, but they just want the listing. So they'll agree. Then you get 2 or 3 or 4 agents do that, and that's the new floor.
That's it.
In the market. And we're starting to see that now. So don't be surprised when you start to see 2 sets of data points come out with the days on market scenario being that you'll see these properties that are long on days on market, but they'll get their price.
Yes.
And then you'll see properties that are very short days on market because they've been listed or put on the internet in the sweet spot representing value and the buyer is just in there straight away.
Or the alternative could be that it's with agent A who's had it at the higher price and they've had a crack at it for 4 or 5 months because the vendor was unrealistic. Then agent B comes along and says, I can sell it to you and you know what, I can get it at this price because that's how it should be priced. Because they've been disillusioned by the first agent, not any fault of the agent itself, the second agent comes in, takes it at a much lower listed price and they sell it within days.
Yeah, and it's actually well known within the real estate industry for all the sales agents that if you're the second listing agent, that's where you've sold the property.
Exactly, because the vendor's well conditioned by then.
Yeah. And that's another bit of rhetoric, conditioning. Maybe we'll do a whole glossary of terms podcast and an explanation around it because there is so many expressions within the industry that is obviously industry centric. So we've got this looming undersupply, which you'd mentioned earlier on, but when we're starting to see that come to fruition in terms of stock on market, and a lot of agents are reporting that their listings, so the amount of properties that they've got for sale is up to 50% lower than what it was this time last year.
Yep.
One of the other data points that we look at, and you can track this, is high search intent, which we've talked about over the last couple of months. And we've seen that high search intent from the consumer get larger and larger and larger and larger. Now, that's also around infection rates. It's a pretty obvious statement, but it's very closely correlated to the infection rates and mobility. So we've seen that high search intent in Melbourne in particular drop away, but over the last couple of weeks we've started to see that actually increase dramatically because people have got a little bit of a sense of mobility, but they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. So this pent up of purchasing is now getting closer and closer where they can act on it, whereas the rest of the East Coast and the West Coast have had a fair bit of mobility, to be fair, and so we haven't seen that drop in high intent search activity. And it is higher today than what it was this time last year.
Yep, which is pretty significant.
That's after an election.
Yes.
Which was a huge result in terms of the property buyers. Sentiment, consumer confidence went through the roof. We've had a crisis, a pandemic since then, and yet high search intent is higher today than what it was this time last year. Now, that's a direct reflection of intent.
Yep. So it's a clear platform that's being set up for a lot of buyers entering the market. So with you wanting to start out in investing, or if you wanted to review where your situation is, to take advantage of the fundamental approach towards investing, you can come and sit down with either myself or Steve. We will map out a plan for you. And if it's not feasible in the sense that we think that you shouldn't be doing it, we will tell you straight away to say, no, you need to sit this one out and relook at your fundamentals, fix that first, then come in and start so that you have a safer start.
Yeah, so put a plan in place, because a plan isn't always about purchasing. It might be the workup.
Yes.
To the purchase.
And it does take time to do that.
Sometimes it takes years and sometimes it takes months. And I mentioned it earlier on, you really do want to be tactical and methodical. It's not let's just create a plan and day by day it'll unfold and unroll and implement. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes we need to hurry and sometimes we need to sit back. And as we've said many, many times, sometimes you'll make more money by doing nothing.
Yeah.
And controlling what you already have rather than adding to it. But everybody's got a different financial footprint and it needs to be assessed accordingly. So, Vic, I think we're at the end of it.
Yeah, we're at the end of it. So if you wanted to chat with us, reach out to us, questions@rightpropertygroup.com.au. Do follow our Facebook page to get notified for our Facebook Live, which comes on every second Thursday of the month. And also, if you haven't listened to our other podcasts, go back in the hierarchy of the podcast and listen to all of that. You'll see that the messaging has not changed significantly in terms of fundamentals, but we have constantly alerted you to the trends to stay away from and the trends to follow in real estate as the market unfolds. So shoot us a question, or if you wanted us to talk about a particular topic, give us a yell.
Yep, and please do us a favour, because it goes a long way for the rest of the team, is jump onto the Facebook page, give us a like, consume the content there. Even on these podcasts, please just give us a rating. It goes a long way and it's well acknowledged. So Vic, until next time, where there'll be a mountain more news, no doubt, because it is such the market, we'll see you then.
Will do.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature, does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs, and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you.